Now that we've talked about the raw processing stage, let's get into the fun stuff and actually retouching the image. So I'm going to export this or open this, however you want to do this, and bring it into Photoshop itself. I'll right click, I'll export, click on variants, and I'll open this as a PSD or a TIFF file. Now the difference between PSDs and TIFF files is pretty much that one is proprietary to Adobe as a PSD, and as a TIFF file, it can also add layers as well, uncompressed. When it comes to 8-bit versus 16-bit, typically I will keep it at 8-bit if there's not a lot of color toning that's happening, or I'll keep it to 16-bit if I know I'm going to be doing a lot of color toning and a lot of contrast and adjustments after the fact. Another advantage is 16-bit is obviously double the size, and 8-bit saves a lot of space as well as memory on your system. For this tutorial, I'm going to keep it at 8-bit just for the speed of everything. And typically, a lot of clients will also ask for files in 8-bit versus 16, but it just depends again on expectations versus what you're looking to get out of it. So I'm going to keep it at format TIFF, 8-bit again, or PSD, depending on what your workflow is. And uncompressed, Adobe RGB. And I use Adobe RGB over ProPhoto just because, again, people like that color space a lot more than ProPhoto in terms of the industry standard. Although ProPhoto can hold a lot more colors overall, Adobe RGB seems to be more relatable when it comes to working with other people. Now I'll keep the resolution at 300, 100%, and open with 2015.5. Export 1. Now what tends to happen is when I get into the actual retouching process, this is going to be reflective on everything we talked about when we were analyzing the image. One of the things that I want to start with is actually doing the cleanup stage. Now what I mean by the cleanup stage in specific is that I use a healing brush and clone brush pretty much 50% of the time when it comes to the workflow. The reason for that is whenever I'm removing blemishes or I'm taking away things on the texture of the skin, which is raised like acne or, things that may cause differentiation or catch your attention when looking at the portrait, are things that I take away. Now, forget words, let's just look at it and let's just get into it so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. The first step that I will do here is once I open up Photoshop, I'm going to be adding a blank layer. And if you want to be really organized, you can add a folder and then take your layer and put it in the folder. This is going to be where all my cleanup is going to happen. Also, if you're not familiar with Photoshop at all, if this is something that you're completely unfamiliar with, I also made another video, which is Photoshop 101 for photographers, which talks about everything Photoshop related, starting from tools to layers to brushes. So that's something to look at in case you're not familiar with how Photoshop works from the beginning. Now let's get into it. So I have the first layer here, which I'm going to be titling Cleanup. Now I'll take my healing brush and use that from the get-go. Now there's something interesting about the healing brush. Depending on what version of Photoshop you have, they have the legacy healing brush, which is something that Photoshop has had all the way up to 2015. And then after 2015, they changed over to a live healing brush. So it allows you to heal instantly. So it doesn't have any wait times. It can heal rapidly. But there's some disadvantages, such as it's not as accurate as a legacy healing brush. Now, in my version, for instance, I'm going to go into my preferences and in my tools. And you'll see under tools, if you're using the most current version of Photoshop, you can bring that legacy brush back. And there's an option here which says use legacy healing algorithms for the healing brush. I typically will leave that on because of the fact that it gives me a more accurate result when I'm working. So with that being said, I'm going to go back into my healing brush on my blank layer set to cleanup. The way the healing brush is going to work for me specifically is I will have my sample set to current and below. That's going to allow me to make sure that every stroke and cleanup process that I do is going to be pasted onto this blank layer, so that if you make a mistake, you can easily erase it or mask it, and I don't need to duplicate any of the background layers. And I don't want to double my file size. So follow along here and check this out. The other thing is a personal preference for me is either keeping the hardness at 100% or 0%. I personally find it's easier to keep the hardness at 0% because I'm working with such a small brush and that it blends a lot better with the transitions every time I heal. It's not necessary that one is obviously better than the other one. I've seen people use both. It's good to experiment. I know people get into a lot of arguments whether they prefer 100% or 0%, which I think most people prefer 100%. So try them both out and see the differences that you like. If you find that it's a lot harder using 100% hardness, then use 0% and see how that works. Don't be stuck with any one thing. There could be uses for both of them. But for me, I prefer 0% because the results tend to be easier for myself. And you'll see as I work through this image. The brush size will be continuing to change as I go through, and I'm going to start working. So I'll use my spacebar to move around. I'll use my Z key to zoom in, and I'll start by working and focusing on some of these areas that are obviously blemishes. So over here I have some blemishes here. I have some lines over here that I'm going to take away. With forehead lines, it really does depend on how deep they are. If they're really deep, it's probably better to lighten them instead of removing them completely. If they're very faint lines like I've done, like you've seen on this portrait example, then I just take them away because they won't be missed. I don't think anyone's gonna really miss them if they're faint lines. I mean, I don't know how you are, but typically with people, they don't really wanna see a lot of the early signs of aging, essentially is what it is. And I take that away. If there's an issue, they'll always tell me to bring it back. You can see here kind of how I'm working. I'm just focusing in on areas that distract me the most first and going in that way. I'm also going to rotate using the E key or the R key on your keyboard, depending on how you have it set up. And then going back to my healing brush. And what that tends to do is allows me to focus on some of the problems that I have and make them much more obvious for me. If you don't know where the rotate key is, you'll see the icon here. And you'll notice that by the key itself, you'll see the shortcut for the actual rotate function. Now, in case you rotate and get stuck, simply hit the escape key and it goes back. So let's continue here. You'll notice that there's not a lot of blemishes. And this is such a good example because it'll familiarize yourself with some of the techniques, but also the method and the principles behind them. Sometimes people ask me, do you really need to rotate so much? And the answer is no, not really. The reason I do it is because it makes retouching much easier for me. And I feel like anytime you rotate, I tend to see things much quicker because there are certain flaws that I only notice at certain angles. And with the rotate function, it helps me kind of cheat to see what they are. Here you'll notice that I'm just removing some of these minor strays that are coming out of the eyebrow. I think a lot of people have them, so that's naturally something I'm going to take away. This step is something that is quite tedious, but really necessary, because if you set the groundwork correctly and just analyze what I'm doing instead of working at the same time, you'll see some of these areas that I'm taking out that are necessary. Let me turn this layer on and off real quick. Let's escape and go back to what we were at before. As you can see, I'm just starting out, but you'll notice that some of these areas that I've taken out right now are some of the distracting areas that I saw up here. And I've left a lot of the freckling. Sometimes you won't know the difference between a freckle and a blemish. For example, you'll see over here that it kind of looks like a freckle, and I think it is. And you might think that it might be a blemish. Well, what do you do in that situation? I think the best course of action is to take it away if you feel like you're not sure. Because typically, if it's something that's really minor, they're not going to miss it. If it's something that's major and you obviously know it's a freckle, then you can probably leave it. For instance, over here, you see the nose line. I'm not going to take away those freckles because that's a part of her, and I imagine she would miss it if you took it away, and she would notice it right away. But does it mean that you should always keep the freckles? No. Sometimes what happens is clients will ask me to take them away because they don't like them. It could be insecurity of theirs. But with portraits, chances are you want to leave them because they may use them for castings and headshots or anything of that nature sometimes. It can be interchangeable, is what I'm trying to say. So let's zoom out here and continue. I will only zoom in a lot, as you've noticed, whenever I see that there's a particular area that I want to fix and I can get to. And the way that I'm doing this is when I hold my Z key and I actually click on the tablet itself and go left and right, you'll see that I can zoom in and out really fluidly. So let's carry on here. On her chin, there's a little blemish, and I'll continue taking that out. And I'll leave the lips for now. So this is me using the healing brush up to now. And the purpose of this example is to keep things really clean and light and showing you my overall workflow and the overall gist of the size of my brush, how light I keep my touch itself. Another thing to note is if you look at my layer itself, I'm going to hold my Option key and click on the eye. You see some of the work that I've done? They're like little bandages in a sense. So I don't dot around the image with my brush. I don't keep clicking on the layer itself over and over again, little strokes. I actually just go in and make a little bandage. So as you've noticed, when I remove something, I'll sample using the Option key, come close, and just cover it up till it's completely gone before letting go of my cursor. What that does is it makes a really clean finish when there's no remnants of the blemish left behind. Let's also get rid of some of these little dots here on the lip. And you can see it's quite reasonable working with the healing brush as long as you listen to the confines of their rules. And the healing brush will help you or it will hurt you. It will really hurt you if you don't pay attention to what you're doing. And it's really tricky because if you don't pay attention to how you're healing, it's going to bite you later. So if you do a bunch of really messy strokes and look at your image after 100 strokes, you'll realize that you've really messed up. And it's not obvious in the beginning unless you do a lot of work and then come back later. Again, I'm only looking for a lot of these blemishes that are standing above and raised above the skin. As you can see from her lip, though those little marks that I took out, they were glaring, at least for me. And on the chin, you notice that there are some blemishes there, under the eyes, on the forehead, and things like that. The other thing that we will be focusing on is now taking care of some of these red lines in the eyes. With portraits, my takeaway is that I'm not going to remove them completely, but what I will do is soften them in the sense that I'll take them away about 50%. So how do you do that? How do you take away something 50% with a healing brush? Well, there's a tricky little shortcut that Photoshop has built in. Let's say that I want to heal this away, but only at 50%. I'll start by just healing normally, okay? Let's say that I did that. Let's say that I want to bring it back just a little bit. I can go to Edit and Fade Healing Brush. So if I do that and bring it back, what it does is it brings back the last stroke that I did and not everything in the layer, just that one stroke. So if I go OK, it brings it back 50%. And now I turn my layer on and off. You see that I've healed it, but only at a certain opacity. You want to make sure that you're not changing the opacity of the layer, because if you do that, everything else is going to come back. You can see if I bring this back here to 0%, you see some of those blemishes that we did come back, and we want to keep it to 100 because we're sensible people. Okay, so let's now go on to our clone brush and show you another way to lessen some of those distracting red lines. So if I go to my clone brush or hit S by default on the keyboard, you'll notice that my clone brush will come up and Q and W will be set to my brush sizes on the keyboard. So I'll hit Option and sample nearby and then come back down. And then with my flow, making sure that it's something really light, I'll set it to something in single digits, sample, and then I'll start brushing. You notice that as I do that, it also has the same effect of lessening or removing some of those red lines. The challenge that this may have is sometimes people will sample in the wrong location. So they may sample somewhere where the light doesn't match the area that they're trying to clone over. So they may sample somewhere over here where it's really light, and then they start brushing, and you notice what happens is that there's like a really bright patch, and you want to do that. You want to make sure that this area matches where you're cloning from. So I'll do that as well over here, kind of pull that back in. And I'll do the same for this red line here. When it comes to red lines in the eyes for portraits, you don't want to remove every single red line. I feel like that might not be a good idea. Just because the whole theme of portraits, for me, my personal opinion, is keeping things a little bit natural, and removing them all together is something that can become really obvious when everything else is also natural. Since there's a lot of reiteration with a lot of the topics and different images that we're covering, I'm not going to go into every single thing because it makes sense to see some of the differences in the distance that I take portraits to. And I'm not going to continue going further than that just to replicate something else. There we go. And this also allows you to keep some of that natural texture in the eye. If you want to bring some back after you've done it, you can quickly switch to the eraser brush with a low flow again and just erase a touch. The shortcut that I have assigned for my flow is just using the keyboard and clicking the numbers. So for example, when I have my brush tool enabled, I have this airbrush tool selected. A part of what that allows me to do is there's two things. One is if I have my regular brush selected. This is just for example purposes. This is not the retouching portion itself. So keep that in mind. What this allows me to do is if I actually click on the image itself with the airbrush icon selected, and if I don't move anywhere and I don't move my mouse or my pen or stylus anywhere, it's going to build up as you see here. So you can see if I don't move it and I keep it clicked, it's going to build up all the way till I get to my opacity. If I don't select it, what's going to happen is my regular paintbrush is not going to build up unless I move, and then it starts building up. Well, that's not the reason why I actually have it enabled, even though it does that in specific. The reason why I have that enabled is that anytime I change my flow settings, you'll notice that it changes instantly as I click on my keyboard. So if I click on 1, it goes to 10%. If I go to 2, it goes to 20%. And that's going to come in handy later, especially with the clone brush. As you can see that when I go to my clone brush, my flow is set really low. And now with one hand, my left hand or my right hand, depending on if you're left-handed or right-handed, I can click on the key itself and use a specific flow. My opacity can stay at 100%, and my flow is going to be the one that typically will change, as you've seen me do as well. So I'll go to my clone brush and adjust that accordingly. And my opacity will stay at 100%. So again, my cleanup stage, let's take a look at how far we've gone. Now, some of these areas that I've removed are some of the areas that I've talked about. We'll keep it really simple for now as we go on to our next stage. We've done our cleaning, which is our healing and our cloning. Some people like to put that in separate layers under the folder, or if you prefer, keeping it under one layer under the cleanup folder is fine as well, depending on if you're the type of person who's really organized or if you're the type of person who just wants to keep everything on the fly as they go. Personally, I won't be as organized normally. I just put layers and work on them because I'm used to knowing where everything is. But for the sake of knowing what I'm doing, it's really important to label and structure things in case I ever need to send this to somebody, they know what to do. And just because this workflow is really easy to go back and adjust and modify anything that you've gone too far on really easily. One other thing that I will quickly do here is I will take my clone brush, and I could obviously darken this or lighten this, which can be done in the next stages, or I can also take my clone brush and even out some of these areas here where there are gaps. So I'll take my sample option, click on the eyebrow here, again low flow. You're gonna hear me say that a bunch of times, and just brush that in. And you'll notice that I filled in that little hair gap over here. Again, I'm gonna come over here and maybe fill in a little bit of this. And I think that looks much better. Also with a clone brush, I can also, let's see, take out some of the hairs in the background. I'm gonna sample underneath or above and follow that light pattern so that it doesn't look obvious that I've, cloned anything in the backdrop. The best part about shooting shallow is the fact that you can paint away some of these as well in case the clone brush doesn't work. And also over here, behind her. You can also use the clone brush to soften up some of the harder textures. So let's say that we have these areas here. If you want to soften them up just a bit, I'm going to rotate really quickly. I will sample next to the area that I want to soften up and just gently go over them. Not a lot. I don't want them to be really obviously softened up, but just enough where the texture kind of dissipates. So I'm going to use my clone brush to ensure that the texture dissipates, but it isn't softened completely. So I'll go here and continue on and just do little shifts here and there. Again, this is optional. This is, I would say, a shortcut. This isn't something that you do all the time. It's one of those things where in a pinch, if you need something, you can do it and it looks pretty okay comparatively. Obviously, I'm going to show you other ways going forward, but that's just one really interesting little shortcut to do. So there you have it. When I zoom out again, let's take a look at some of these areas. Also, another thing that we can do is fix some of these under eyes, but this is where some of the next stages are going to come in handy when we talk about our dodge and burn. Now that you've seen how we've worked and attacked this portrait when it comes to cleanup, now we're going to jump in and take a look at what dodge and burn does and how to utilize it.